Today for Devotions with Daniela, we are reading White Women Get Ready, How Healing from Post-Traumatic Mistress Syndrome Leads to Anti-Racist Change. This is a chapter all about unpaid labor, and I remind you, cults are always about labor. I'm working on this book for my own practice. If you would like to read it with me, you can get signed copies here. My mother was neither a stay-at-home mom nor a working mom. She was both, as are so many mothers in modern America. When I was 6 weeks old, before her uterus had fully shrunk back to size, after 30 plus hours of labor with me, she returned part-time to the labor that offered her a wage. The devaluation and feminization of reproductive labor that occurred at the dawn of capitalism in Europe helps explain why weeks after giving birth, she would get paid to teach nursing in an academic setting, rather than nurse me at home. This devaluation and feminization of reproductive labor likewise set the global scene for colonialization and radicalized enslavement, which helps explain why hundreds of years later, my mother would be able to earn her wage by employing Miss Sylvia at a lower rate at home. Miss Sylvia came to work for my family when I was brand spanking new. My mother asked around in her trusted social circles, and Miss Sylvia's name was mentioned as someone who was looking for work. My mother's usual worry was assuaged by the reassurance that my father would be working from home on the days this stranger was to be entrusted with keeping their new human alive. And so, way before I had any salient memories, Miss Sylvia came into my life. I have one distinct early memory, though. It is the only one I have of the inside walls of a crib. In my memory, I'm surrounded by a soft pastel green and yellow knotted baby quilt as two rotund, melanated arms reach for me. I was at ease being scooped up in her arms. There was no fear. It is a memory filled with loving care. I am aware of the dangers of romanticizing my relationship with Miss Sylvia, as have so many other white people before me, and I will further consider white sentimentalizing and the mammy stereotype in chapters 5 and 11. But for this initial discussion of reproductive labor, I want to emphasize how reproductive, emotional, and productive forms of labor can't really be separated out. The emotional extension required for parenting and child rearing can't really be removed from diaper changes, bottle feeding, and appropriate hugs. I mean, despite patriarchy's gaslighting, those forms of emotional labor are always there, and they always have been. Of course, I'm not the first to recognize this. The concept of emotional labor, first referenced in 1979 by Arlie Hochschild in The Managed Heart, Commercialization of Human Feeling, as a way to identify the invisibilized work of laborers in the service industry, such as smiling and catering to a customer's emotions, has become shorthand for a wide range of relational work. In activist circles, emotional labor is used to point to the many invisibilized ways someone with less systemic power does the work of educating and placating the emotions of someone with more systemic power. Like white women for white men and black women for everyone. This type of unpaid, underpaid, and or unrecognized labor is a necessary skill set in order to successfully do a job, maintain access to institutions and resources, and keep oneself and others safe. In an interview, Rose Hackman, author of the book Emotional Labor, notes that this extractive, coercive labor is a way men benefit from women's free and unacknowledged labor. Moreover, it hits those with the least access to systemic power especially hard. Hackman describes those who resonated with the concept the most. The women who connected to this issue the most were actually working-class black women, who were often carrying entire families along, not just financially, but emotionally. They were expected to do an enormous amount of emotional labor that was extraordinarily invisible. They were maybe nursing assistants during the day, which is a huge amount of emotional labor that is not really properly paid for. And they were going home at night and doing an extra shift. As I sit here considering which story about emotional labor to share with you from my life, I'm struck by how many there are to choose from. Do I share with you early memories of female family members sidestepping the wide range of my father's reactivity? Or about how the church mothers operationalized congregational life while the male pastors monologued for pay? Do I share about how I've left many a first date exhausted, realizing afterward that I had listened to him talk the entire time, inserting my voice only when it was to ask a question? Do I share about how in one romantic relationship, those please and appease skills were what kept me safe, especially when I realized I needed to leave but didn't feel safe enough to do so? Do I share about how in almost every job I've worked, from childcare to education to community organizing, emotional labor really just was the job, even though much of that wasn't written into its description? I'm sure you have many stories too. I'm thinking again about the 4Ds and deference as a survival strategy. Deference as a form of emotional labor is part of a vocabulary that we have had to learn to stay safe. Deference as please and appease can mean choosing silence in order to keep the peace, or deflecting attention away from the ways we may be viewed as a threat. Author and editor Adrienne Marie Brown writes in Pleasure Activism, "Our silence has protected us against potential violence, an unfortunately common response of patriarchy and or other kinds of power when met with rejection." I'm thinking about how the invisibilization of emotional layer may offer an added layer of protection. Or at least we've become skilled in leveraging it that way. Perhaps the erasure of my emotional labor meant that he didn't know my please and appease was, in fact, a skilled exit strategy to get me safely out the door. Perhaps in absence of an accurate job description, the institution becomes more dependent on me. But like defensiveness, denial, and distancing, deference has its limits. These are survival strategies, not necessarily liberating ones. As Brown notes, silence played some role in helping us survive to get to this moment, but silence will not get us to a place of power over our bodies. In Pittsburgh in the mid-2010s, as the concept of emotional labor was becoming popularized on social media and in pop culture, the people in my organizing communities were resonating with it too. Notably, the Black women around me seemed to find this term especially useful in describing the extra work they had been doing on behalf of men, but especially on behalf of white women. Done with overextending themselves, they sent many white women my way. Often these conversations with fellow white women started with me asking why they thought their colleagues, coworkers, and friends may have set the boundary that led to our call. Often at some point, these white women would describe a parallel, though not equivalent, example of how they likewise felt pressured to overextend themselves for families, partners, and bosses. Naming the ways emotional labor serves power can be especially useful when a member of a marginalized group is expected to perform it underpaid or unpaid on behalf of a member of a relatively advantaged group. There is validation in reclaiming emotional labor as real work, in honoring the exhaustion and inequities and calling out the resulting imbalance. Personally, becoming more connected to emotional labor as real work has helped me become more honest with myself about my capacity. It has helped me get clearer about how I've survived and how I've enabled. And as we will continue to unpack in these pages, the emotional labor done both by and on behalf of white women certainly has something to say about mistress syndrome. That my one-on-one with fellow white women revealed both their own emotional overextension as well as an overdependence on the emotional labor of Black colleagues points to how our misuse has enabled us to misuse others. This dynamic is a tried and true strategy of the wicked webs and one that is in need of disrupting. The era of mercantilism may have programmed us to think that reproductive labor does not constitute real work. But perhaps that programming is an indication of its deep worth. As Hackman points out, a huge way in which this extraction of labor is extraordinarily beneficial to men and how patriarchy at large is able to continue is that we refuse to accept that emotional labor is real in spite of all the evidence that exists that shows that obviously it is extraordinarily valuable. Obviously. Like much of our work in healing from mistress syndrome, noticing is a first great step. As status quo and passing white ladies, we can start by becoming more aware of when reproductive labor is happening. We can bring our attention to our deference, our silences, and the extensions of our emotional labor. This means becoming more honest about our relational dynamics, family systems, and workplace cultures. You can check out White Women Get Ready, pinned here.